I'm Dr. Andrea Pennington. I'm an integrative physician, acupuncturist, documentary filmmaker, best-selling author, and international speaker. I help doctors, therapists, coaches, speakers, and authors share their message with the world in the areas of resilience, trauma healing, and self-love. It's all part of my mission to elevate the level of consciousness in our world. After living for years, hiding depression and anxiety, I know how isolated and sickening it feels to be trapped, not living life aligned with your authentic self. As I've shared in my books and TED Talks, music saved my life and set me free from depression. And through a near-death experience and sacred plant medicine ceremonies, I reconnected with my soul and got a whole new vision to live for. Now I combine my media communication experience with my professional expertise in neurofeedback, meditation, and holistic healing, in films, on stages, TV shows, and podcasts, in boardrooms and retreat centers around the world. My books, life writing programs, and brand mentoring academy are all designed to empower you to transform, heal, and thrive in business, love, and life. Hello, beautiful soul. Lovely to be connected again. Welcome. I am your host, Dr. Andrea Pennington. You just saw the intro. You know that. Guess what we are talking about today? We are talking about intergenerational trauma and some holistic approaches to how we might heal that. So wherever you are tuning in from, whether you're on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, watching the replay, type #replay if you are. And if you're here with us live, type into the chat where you are tuning in from. I would love to know. So you've heard me talking a lot about adverse childhood experiences, how to build resilience, positive childhood experiences, and how they can protect us or prevent PTSD and other health conditions in adulthood. Well, one area that is a little bit murky for some people is this idea of intergenerational trauma. And that means trauma that gets passed down through family lines, through generations. Even family members we may have never met or been exposed to have potentially impacted us, our health, our behaviors, and our overall sense of well-being. So I'm going to dive right in. It's been a while since I've done some teaching, so buckle up, get ready. So first off, I want to just talk a little bit about trauma. This is a hot topic right now. I don't know if you've checked out the film, The Wisdom of Trauma, by some lovely Italian folks who have interviewed Dr. Gabor Mate and several others in their full interview series. So there's a lot of people talking about trauma. And Gabor Mate often is quoted saying that trauma is not about what happened to you. It's about your response to or how you processed what happened to you. So the way I like to look at trauma is it is when we have witnessed or experienced some event or been in an environment, including birth, where our life has felt threatened or at risk. So that covers a whole lot of ground, right? And there may be some things that are not at all traumatic for me that could be potentially traumatic for you. So it's one of those things that we have to really get clued into, right? So when you think about trauma, what do you think of? Type into the chat and let me know, because I'd love to hear from you. Typically, when we are thinking about trauma, in the past, therapists, doctors, we've talked about things in terms of big T or capital T traumas and little t traumas. And the big T's are witnessing or experiencing physical or sexual abuse, a terrorist attack. It could have also been that you witnessed someone else being, brutalized. Those are typically what we think of as big T traumas. But we now know that just growing up in a dysfunctional or chaotic home can also be perceived as traumatic. Again, if we go back to the definition of trauma as being the witness of or the experiencer of an event or an environment that made one feel that they were at risk or that your well-being was threatened. So afterward, after experiencing one of these traumatic events, or after you're growing up in the soup that is a dysfunctional family, what happens to you? In the masterclass that I did about positive childhood experiences, we understand now that the way we are treated, how we are treated if we have witnessed or experienced trauma, if you were a child, for example, and you experienced developmental trauma or what we might call attachment trauma, meaning your principal attachment figure may not have been there reliably and consistently, or they were just completely absent or even abusive and neglectful. Those kinds of wounds, if we had a compassionate caregiver, a person who could help us process that, because typically as children, we don't yet have the higher brain centers to process what's going on with us. And so whether we have been witnessed, heard, were our feelings validated or rejected, were we believed if we spoke up about some trauma, abuse, or being bullied, were we comforted? It's actually those positive experiences that can counterbalance some of the effects of trauma. So that means that just because one goes through trauma doesn't mean that you actually have to have all of these lifelong characteristics of PTSD, anxiety, worry, all on and on. But it really does depend on the processing. So Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, they both said that whatever is too difficult to be processed is not going to go away on its own. Instead, we will end up with fragments of memory, feelings, sensations, and words that all get stored in the subconscious, only to be reactivated or triggered later when the environment or a person or some smell or sight can trigger us, and we find ourselves reacting in the very same ways that that we did in the past or that we saw modeled to us from the past. So just wanted to tease that up. Comments, questions, feel free to type in the chat if any of this does not make sense. All right, so back to our topic. We're talking about inherited traumas. Now, if we think about certain diseases that we have a genetic predisposition for, things like diabetes, certain cancers, Alzheimer's, like in your mind, that's probably easy to get. Like you get the idea that that could be transmitted genetically. We inherit that. So that might seem very obvious, but did you also know that your tendency to be anxious with certain fears, feelings, or behaviors, that can also be passed down the family line? And so what we understand now is that we unknowingly adopt certain feelings and behaviors or reactions that keep this cycle of trauma alive. And it can even go for multiple generations. It can skip generations as well. And so part of my work on this new training that I'm in to become a psychedelic assisted therapy facilitator, I've been revisiting some of these books that I read in the past, like The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, Awakening the Tiger by Peter Levine, the creator of the somatic experiencing technique. But I want to read to you something from a book by Mark Wolynn, who is big in family constellations. He wrote a book called It Didn't Start With You. Quote, "Even if the person who suffered the original trauma has died, even if his or her story lies in submerged silence, fragments of life experience, memory, and body sensation can live on as if reaching out from the past to find resolution in the minds and bodies of those living in the present." That's from Mark Wolin. It didn't start with you. And so it's really important for us to get this concept that it's like unfinished business and trauma loops. And this is why we need a holistic approach to healing trauma. And so what we now know with the study of epigenetics, that is the study of how the environment can impact our gene expression, we now know that we have to look at 3 generations to see certain links between traumatic experience in the past and what we are living or what we may be passing on to our children. So it might, again, seem very obvious that if you happen to have grown up in a situation where you experienced a lot of stress. For example, we talk a lot about the ACE score. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And there was a study done that got published in 1998, just as I was finishing medical school, by Drs. Robert Anda and Vincent Felitti in association with the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And they looked at 17,000 health records, looking at adults and comparing their health in adulthood to what they experienced in childhood. And what they found is that adults that had 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences had a greater likelihood of developing diseases and behavioral problems as adults. So what are these ACEs? In their study, they covered 10, which you'll typically see when you take a quiz to find out your ACE score. If you visit my website, you can take the quiz for free. It's on innatevitality.com, but it is also on my other website, andreapennington.com. So when you take this quiz, you're going to be answering some questions about, before the age of 18, did you experience or witness being abused? So physical abuse, sexual abuse. This can also include neglect. Did you, before the age of 18, have a family member who died or there was divorce, a family member with mental illness, a person close to the family committing suicide? Now, those are the basics, but we now know that we need to add in things like, did you experience extreme poverty, natural disasters? I think COVID counts as a sort of natural disaster. But that can also include hurricanes and tsunamis that create devastation around a community. Did you experience extreme bullying? And this could include all of the isms, so sexism and homophobia and racism. All of those have impacts on us and could lead to having a higher ACE score. And so what we know, and you can go back to my website, andreapennington.com, or my YouTube channel, and you can see my past quiz about, my past masterclass about this. The past masterclass goes into very great detail about the ACEs and how they impact the body. But what I can tell you right now in summary is they impact our nervous system and developing brain, our immune system, and our cardiovascular system. And so that means it makes it much more easy for you to understand why there is this long list of A to Z diseases that we are impacted by if we have grown up with that adverse childhood experience. Now, my ACE score is 4. And the ACE scores of my parents were both 4. So it's no wonder why I grew up with depression and later had anxiety. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I am going to let my dear friend, Sandra D., the artist, explain or express to you a list of health conditions. Check this out.
High levels of trauma, abuse, dysfunction, and discrimination lead to an increased risk of alcoholism and substance abuse, allergies, Alzheimer's, anorexia, anxiety, arthritis, asthma, autoimmune disease, acting out behaviors, binge eating, cancer, chronic fatigue syndrome, compulsive shopping, gambling, overeating, criminality, depression, diabetes, fibromyalgia, heart disease, high blood pressure, poor immune function, infertility, lung disease, liver disease, early mortality, osteoporosis, premature aging, relationship difficulty, smoking, sexual risk behavior, suicide, and violence.
That's a lot, right? And we didn't include in the list PTSD or complex PTSD. And that's when you have this constellation of things like anxiety, startling very easily, being hypervigilant, always on edge. People with PTSD also complain of depression, anxiety, nightmares, or intrusive thoughts where they're reliving past memories. And all of that is seen in people who have high ACE scores. So be sure to take that quiz and find out your ACE score. You'll find that the reason that we want you to know is so that you can do something about it. And that's why I'm here. So thank you again, Sandra D. I so appreciate you recording that voiceover for us. And Sandra D is here. So she says, thank you for addressing this intergenerational inherited trauma. I felt this years ago, but never knew it was a real thing until I found you. Everything makes so much sense now. It does for me too. You know, I grew up kind of thinking like, why am I struggling with these problems? You know, it seemed like everything on the outside looked good. Like, why was I suffering? And now I know. So we know that if one parent had PTSD, then we are 3 times more likely to experience PTSD ourselves. We know that PTSD is inherited, as in by the genes, and not just exposure. It's like we might think, oh yeah, if my mom was completely stressed out, if she was being abused, or if my dad was under so much pressure from an aggressive boss and financial pressures, that stress would have leaked onto me. That's not what we're talking about here. Yes, that does impact us, but what we're talking about is some of the findings that came from Rachel Yehuda, who is a psychiatrist and head of neuroscience at Mount Sinai Hospital. Rachel Yehuda and many of her studies and other colleagues since have studied Holocaust survivors and their children. And what they found is that these people had low cortisol. Now, this was kind of controversial at the time because most people think of stress as high cortisol. But we do know that the longer you are exposed to stress, you get this suppression thing happening, and we end up with low cortisol. And so she also found that this was true in war vets. They had low cortisol that corresponded with PTSD-like symptoms. And they also found this in women who were pregnant and near the World Trade Center when the attacks happened on September 11th, 2001. Those women and their children, also the children that they were carrying at that time, have low cortisol. So, makes sense? So yes, Valerie, we are also talking about the environmental effects. Absolutely. The environmental effects are what turn on or could turn on gene expression. And I'm going to get into this in a little bit of detail. You can forget all the science afterward, but I think you're going to benefit from this understanding. And glad to see you, Nancy. I've heard so much about you. And yes, family constellation. That quote that I just read by Mark Wolin, he is a family constellation guy. And that you will see in just a moment is one of the approaches to dealing with this intergenerational trauma. Okay, so now we can understand why a first-generation offspring, like myself, would experience high stress and all sorts of PTSD and all these other conditions, right? You get that now. That seems pretty easy. So what about second and third generation? Well, when you think about this, our earliest biological form is an unfertilized egg, right? And we existed in a shared environment with our mother and our grandmother. So get this, your grandmother when she was 5 months along in her pregnancy, the precursor cell that was going to become the egg that you developed from, well, that was already in your mom's ovaries while she was in your grandma's belly. And so when we're looking at this third generation impact, we share the same biological environment. Okay? So this is also true if we look at the precursor cell of the sperm that your father contributed to make you. That precursor cell was actually present when he was a fetus in his mother's womb. The difference between your father's sperm and your mother's egg is that his sperm was still susceptible to ongoing shock and trauma all the way up till the moment you were conceived. Whereas for a woman, once our eggs are made, they're sort of in a somewhat protected state up until you're delivered. So it's not something that can be dismissed. All right, so what does that mean? This means that the genetic imprint started at least 3 generations back. We're going to get into cultural, historical trauma and how that impacts us as well, because that's a real thing. But I wanted you to just get this understanding that our environment from conception onward can shape us emotionally, psychologically, and biologically. All right? And Valerie, I am on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I am not on Zoom today. Next week, I will be, though. All right, so for those of you that care, how does this happen in our genes? Well, there is some non-coding DNA, and when we are stressed, again, it could be our grandmother that was stressed. If there were problems with poverty or violence, famine, war, if she was under chronic stress, we could have seen that there was some changes to the non-coding DNA. Now, Rachel Yehuda and subsequent colleagues have identified specific genes that get impacted. I won't bore you with the science, but just understand that there's this little tag. It's a methylation. A methyl group gets added onto the DNA. It doesn't change the structure of the DNA. It basically suppresses the expression of that gene. So that gene won't be expressed. Now, that could be a positive thing. You might get this little tag that says, don't express some negative function, but if it was a helpful gene that helped you fight aging or fight free radicals that lead to other diseases or cancer, that's not so helpful. Make sense? All right, so all of this brings me to what some people are calling legacy burdens. So you get this now physiologically down to a DNA level, what happened to our ancestors could have been passed on to us, and we might be passing it on to our children. But now I want to talk about a little bit more on the psychology side of things rather than just the genetic side. And this requires that we understand that we all have parts. If you look at internal family systems, we talk about the self. I call it the authentic self. The authentic self is the real you. It is that spark of God consciousness, your soul that incarnated to live out your destiny. And if you happen to have a perfect childhood and you had parents and caregivers that encouraged you to be you, do you, not be afraid, express yourself, then you might have a lot of what we call self-energy. Like you feel that you are confident, you're compassionate, you're present, you're connected, right? However, many of us, even if we did have a great childhood, we will still have parts of us that got some messaging that we took on. So parts of us may have taken on extreme beliefs and emotions, and they attach to a part that drives our behaviors in somewhat extreme ways. So I always use myself as an example, sometimes my clients, but in this case, I'll use myself as an example. Growing up, I heard that an education was my number one ticket to safety. My father, who came from very meager beginnings, he heard early on, you're smart, get an education, get out of here. And he passed that down to us. Now, this little tender part of me that was looking at the environment of my childhood, I saw that Dad was pretty harsh and critical about school with my brother. And so part of me said, well, I don't want to get spanked. I want to keep Dad happy. So I'm going to be a good girl. I'm going to get good grades. So that part of me took on this belief that in order to be good, I needed to have good grades. In order to get a love and affection, I needed to do the right things. And that led that part all the way through my life to take on these protective or managing characteristics of being a perfectionist, overproving, overworking, overgiving, all the overs. Does this make sense to you? I guess so. So what's interesting is that when we directly experience some sort of abuse or wound or even neglect, we might have these injuries, and then parts of us have to make sense of that. Like, depending on where you were in your development, if you didn't, you might have even been pre-verbal. You might not have even had the intellectual or brain capacity to make sense of what was going on. And so you might just have this deep felt sense that you're wrong or you're bad or you're defective, that you're not wanted, that it's your fault. And then as you grew up, that part may have manifested certain behaviors. And so I want us to be aware of how we are impressionable as children and our parts take on these very extreme behavioral reactions and emotional reactions. And in the words of Dick Schwartz, when we look at internal family systems, he says that these familial and cultural burdens are very powerful organizers of our experience. They guide us to stay safe or to fit in or to get ahead. They become these protectors and managers. Unfortunately, some parts of us that may have been shamed or belittled or not appreciated get pushed over into the shadow. And in IFS, internal family systems, we call those exiles. So there may be parts of you that you've disowned, denied, hidden away, suppressed. Those typically tend to be the exiled parts. All right, so let's say, for example, I happen to be the child of an immigrant mother and an African-American father. My mother was from British Guyana, South America. And I have talked with very many of my friends who had immigrants as parents, immigrants to the United States, who said, don't you know how much we sacrificed? We worked so hard to give you and your brothers and sisters a better life. Like, this whole conversation was pushed on us. And what does the young mind do? We take on these beliefs that I need to be self-sacrificing. I need to not worry about my needs because mom and dad did so much. I need to be grateful, or it might be that perfectionist. My first TED Talk in Monaco was Become Who You Really Are. I talked about my story about how I got pushed into going into med school and denying the artist part of me. And then that erupted in all sorts of self-loathing and depression. And many people who saw that talk say, that's me. I did that too. Now what do I do? I want to do what you're doing. I want to live my truth. But they feel incredible guilt because their parents made all this sacrifice and all of this. You get where I'm going with this? They've carried this heavy burden that I have to do something to make my parents proud. I have to make their sacrifice worth it. And so we become the good girl or the good boy or the hero of the family. And yet we still carry this part of us that says, I can't really do what I want. Does this make sense? Yes. Okay. So Valerie, you say that perfectionism is prominent for you. I would be curious to know why. Do you know where you picked that up? Where did that pattern come from? So let's say that you had a neglectful or an absent parent. And depending on your development, You may not have had words, but you got this feeling that you're just not important. Your needs aren't important. When you cried, if you weren't picked up and held and comforted, or you were literally told, don't cry, suck it up, you might have felt like my needs, my feelings aren't valid. And so what happens is a part of us might take on this belief that I shouldn't be so needy and demanding. Like you might have this inner critic that develops that's like, look at you, stop that. Or you might have a part of you may have taken on this belief that, I need to look after others. I need to be the caretaker, or I need to be the martyr, sacrifice myself. This is what leads to martyrdom. This is what leads to codependency in many people. Perhaps you grew up with an alcoholic parent or a very critical parent, and your young mind says, well, I don't want to be like them. I don't want to be that. And so maybe you grew up, and as a parent, you're super strict and you're super driven because you want to show your kids what not to do. And then they unfortunately might end up picking up some of the behaviors of the grandparent, because all of that pressure on a kid, they might develop that thinking that, well, I'm not enough just as I am. There's too much pressure. And they can either just opt out. This is what happens for some people who just drop out. They're just like, I'm just not going to work that hard. I'm not going to try that hard. It's too much. Or they seek comfort. They medicate their own psychic pain with drugs, alcohol, sex. They become a workaholic, or they become an abuser as well. Sometimes for those of us that took on this sense of, I need to be more, the flip side of that is basically, I'm not enough, underneath it. And that is what leads to this sense of being really overwhelmed, this compulsive need to prove oneself. Oh my gosh, that was so much a part of my life as a result of what I lived. Anyway, so you get a sense of this, right? You get a sense of how emotional reactions and behavioral patterns can get taken on by different parts of us. So we have this inner critic, and we have different managing parts that manage your looks and your performance and judging. And I mean, it's endless. I invite you to check out IFS or join us for the Real Self-Love Live, where I go into this in more depth and can answer questions. But so that's the basics of what happens in families. And then if we look at cultural legacy burdens, so typically when you think of a legacy, it's like, what's that mark that we want to leave and pass on? Well, a legacy could either be a blessing or it can be a burden. And some of the cultural legacy burdens that we think of are things like racism, sexism, living under communism, capitalism. All of those imprints are embedded in our psyche, where we start to feel like, as a person of color, it's not safe. It's not safe to be just walking while black or driving while black. It's not safe to be seen. And so those messages that we either hear or they're impressed upon us can often lead us to underbeing, to just, I need to stay under the radar. And underbeing often leads to under-earning. So we're never fully living up to our greatest potential because of these things. It leads to, on the other side of it, my mother, who I mentioned, she was a brown, in her words, she used to say, here I am, a brown-skinned woman with a funny accent. She immigrated to the United States and went to medical school when she was 38. I was just a baby. She always said, she experienced a lot of racism. And her response to that was, suck it up and just show them I know my stuff. Show them what I got. Show them I'm worth it. And I didn't realize how much that impacted me until I started experiencing racism. And I didn't feel like I could come home and complain about it, because I'd heard my mom kind of say, you just show them that you're better. And colorism, when I moved to Atlanta and got hazed by black people because I wasn't brown enough or black enough, and I didn't sound black enough. Anyway, so all of that is to say that these cultural or historical burdens get passed down to us as well. If you happen to have parents or grandparents who experienced extreme poverty, famines back in the day, those kind of imprints lead us to feel like there's never enough. And so there's this compulsive saving or hoarding, not spending, or deprivation, like depriving oneself of good things because of fear. But it also leads some people to overspending and debting, like that sense of poverty consciousness. Once people got to adulthood and found that credit cards were freely given, many people became compulsive debtors. So I know this is a lot to process, and I hope that if you're interested in this and you want to take a little bit of a deeper journey with me, next Tuesday I'm leading a private Zoom session in the Real Self-Love live. You can find out about that on my website, andreapennington.com. And there I will be leading a guided meditation to help you process some of this stuff. All right, so let's get into one more type of burden that can happen, and that is when it's projected on you. I remember just feeling horrified several years ago when I was still living in the United States. I heard this woman at a grocery store. Her son was doing something, and she looked at him with so much anger and hatred. And she said, "Get up, you just like your father." Now, it wasn't a kind like, "Oh, your father's great." I mean, there was this sense that she was comparing him to the worst sides of his father. And in fact, when hatred is projected on us from someone else or from the culture, many people will take that on. And then when one does express a trait that is like one's father or whoever that hated group is, one can start to feel incredible shame. That was part of my story, with this idea that being artistic was somehow considered a bad thing. Oh, the arts and music and theater and all the stuff that I loved was like, yeah, that's nice, but it's not a secure way to live. And that made me feel incredible shame anytime I had these creative impulses that were literally ready to take over my life. All right, so hopefully this is making sense. Yes? All right, I'm going to look at the chat now. So some of the comments. So Valerie, yes, your perfectionism came partially from one parent being more strict than the other. Makes so much sense. And then Valerie asked, what about pain that's being passed down the lineage? From an astrology session, it was seen that I might be a circuit breaker. Yes. Well, we are, those of us who are awakening and we're tuning into a broadcast like this, you can be a circuit breaker or a cycle breaker, as we call it, meaning you can make a firm delineation to say, this stops with me. So how do we break these cycles of intergenerational pain and drama that's passed down through our lineage? Well, what I've seen over 20 years as an integrative physician and therapist, leading groups and workshops around the world for addiction and eating disorders and trauma, I will first tell you the things that have only limited effectiveness. I'm not saying don't try them, but I'm saying they are limited. And that includes talk therapy, DBT, CBT, EMDR. Many of these are great for symptomatic relief. You might feel a decrease in some symptoms right away. But in terms of healing and resolving the trauma, now that you understand that there's a genetic component, there's a somatic or body-based component, there's also a psychological, in the subconscious mind component, and there's an energetic component. There's something about the energy in our field or in our system that's impacted with these traumas. And so I believe that a holistic, integrative approach is the way to go. So we're talking about somatic or body-based therapies. That could be yoga, massage, somatic experiencing. I mentioned Dr. Peter Levine, who created this technique. The Hakomi method, or NARM, These are methods that deal with trauma that's locked in the body, because for many of us, an intellectual understanding, like even hearing this, like this may be sending off some light bulbs, you may be having a major aha moment, and that is great. That insight will help you, but it's often not enough. An intellectual understanding is not enough. And so if it's locked in the body, then look at somatic or body-oriented psychotherapies. Breath work. Breath work is incredibly powerful. Holotropic breath work, as created by Christina and Stanislav Grof, highly, highly recommended, because you can get into these non-ordinary states of consciousness, expanded states of consciousness, just like with psychedelics, that give you access to the subconscious mind and to the energies in your field and in the field of your ancestors. So breath work is incredibly powerful. And yes, Valerie, craniosacral therapy, very helpful on a symptomatic level, and could be helping to release some of the stored energy in the body. Internal family systems and family constellations, psychodrama, these are great ways to use Gestalt, which is kind of like multiple chairs or standing in the stair, the footprints of your ancestors, and playing out some role dynamics. Incredibly helpful. Incredibly helpful. Meditation, particularly meditation with neurofeedback. Definitely check out my YouTube channel or Innate Vitality, and you'll see a video where I'm interviewing Judith Pennington, the founder of the Institute for the Awakened Mind. She's the one who trained me in my level 1 training of neurofeedback. And you've probably heard Bessel van der Kolk raves about neurofeedback as a way to heal trauma that is more empowering to us, because we learn how to impact our own brainwaves to get into these states where we can heal and release and unburden ourselves. Narrative therapy. Narrative therapy is a technique that I use all day, every day. It's in all of my books. Narrative therapy, or what I call life writing, includes certain prompts. You're prompted to do some journal writing. For most of it, it might just be a download, just a dump of things that happened to you in the past, without editing, without reflecting, without the risk of sharing it with anyone. Dr. James Pennebaker and many of his successors over the last 20 plus years have studied the effect of narrative therapy. And it's one of the reasons why I love it, because it does allow us to access the subconscious mind, particularly if you also add in writing with your non-dominant hand. You can learn all about that with me in the Real Self-Love movement, but that's incredibly powerful. Some people find that hypnosis, neurolinguistic programming, Akashic records, these may sound a little woo-woo, especially coming from an MD. Well, not hypnosis. Hypnosis is, clinically proven, but the idea that you could tap into this book of life and find out, did you have soul contracts with people? Could you end things on a lineage level? Absolutely. There are many indigenous cultures that have rites of passages. They have all sorts of ceremonies where we can give these traumatic energies back to our ancestors, or back to the light or fire or Mother Earth to be processed. Meaning we're not dumping it back on them. We're just saying, this is not mine. I don't need to carry that. I, of course, find that it's not for everyone, but psychedelic assisted therapy can be incredibly helpful for releasing and unburdening from intergenerational trauma. I've done sacred ceremonies with plant medicine and found incredible healing on an energetic level and a psychologic level. So there's a whole host of things that I've shared with you, and it's a lot. Yes, Valerie, Akashic records are very interesting. I recently had an Akashic record reading with Siv Harstad, the adventurer from Norway, and I think I should probably do an interview with her so she can explain it. But it was interesting because in this Akashic records thing, you can invite your guides to help you resolve things like soul contracts. So much good stuff, right? I invite you to join me on the second Tuesday of the month. I go live in the Real Self-Love movement. It's totally free, and it's a monthly group coaching. I also lead a guided meditation where we do some of this unburdening. And for the month of October 2021, I'm going to be doing a guided meditation to release these legacy burdens. So it's totally free. Visit my website so that you can sign up. It's on AndreaPennington.com. You'll also get access to previous months' recordings. There are years and years of them, and they're really, really helpful for resolving traumas of this lifetime, past lifetimes, and intergenerational. And then starting in November, I'm super excited because the Hero Collective is starting. This is a 12-month membership that includes my life writing program to help you rewrite your personal narrative, a story that you tell yourself about yourself. It also includes guided meditations that you can download. Plus, I lead guided meditations live that will help you reprogram your mind and rewire your brain. And I'm leading you through the hero's journey. This is a program that has been adapted from Stories with Soul, which is a live workshop that I've taught for several years that includes all of the life writing prompts that I explained using the hero's journey as described by Joseph Campbell. This is really empowering because you can be the hero of your own life story. That's what you were destined to be. So you can get on the list to be notified when enrollment starts by visiting my website. The Hero Collective will be accessible for everyone, and I'm so excited to be able to lead you on this year-long journey. All right? So, what, my friends, are your questions before we wrap up this session? Was this too much information? Was this helpful? Please type into the chat and let me know. Awesome, Sandra. So grateful for your presence and so grateful to know that this was helpful and that you're bathing in self-love. And Valerie, what's the best option if you're not able to go to therapists? There are a lot of great teachers and wisdom keepers on YouTube and on social media. I did mention that the Real Self-Love is totally free. It is not psychotherapy, but it is very therapeutic. And the resources and the live masterclasses are all free. You'll find that there's a lot of help and healing. And the Real Self-Love includes all of the work and the worksheets that come from my book, the Real Self-Love Handbook. And these are the same things that I use in my therapeutic sessions. So it can be a wonderful start for you before you go to therapy or in addition to therapy. All right. Yes. So awesome, Sandra D. I can't wait to be able to work with you again and see you in the Hero Collective. You are a master storyteller. You had us laughing and crying this year, so I'm really very glad that you'll be with us. And Chef, it's always good to see you. And Dr. Karina, good to see you as well. So if there are any questions, I am happy to entertain them. I do hope that I will see you next week in the Real Self-Love Live, where you will get to, ask me questions live, and I can lead you in the attunement process, the guided meditation for unburdening from some of these burdens. Pascal, de rien. It is avec plaisir. Very happy to be here. Nancy, will I come to Asheville? Well, sure. Is that an invitation? I'll come to Asheville. It'll probably have to be the fall because, that hot, sticky weather is not for me. But absolutely, would love to meet you in person. And beautiful Shireen says, I can relate to so many layers of inherited pressures and acting them out. Today, I'm really struck by seeing being good under the radar of success to prevent the pains I witnessed in my parents' experience, gender and race oppression and poverty. For the last few months, I'm experiencing a lot of resistance to gratitude journaling. Well, you know what? I really believe that the greatest thing that we can do for our ancestors is to heal and to thrive. Now, I will say, Shireen, I totally get where you're coming from when you say, like, you don't want to repeat the experience that your parents had. And so being under the radar, a lot of us have experienced that. A lot of us in our community, the Make Your Mark Global, all of my global luminaries, I heard from people say, I go under the radar because they believe that in a previous lifetime, they might have been burned at the stake. And so it feels safer to hide. And so the invitation is to heal. So I hope that I will see you next week on the Real Self-Love Live, where we can do some of this ancestral healing. I'll lead you in a guided meditation. They're all recorded, so you can watch it again and again and do this practice again and again. And I would say, Shireen, with that resistance that you feel, I would be kind to it. Rather than pushing past the resistance, which is what many of us do, because we intellectually we're like, come on, suck it up, you should be better than that. All that shoulding, don't should on yourself. Instead, I would tune in and connect with that part of you, that part that feels resistance. And see if you can sit and just get curious to know, where did that come from? Where does your resistance come from? What are you afraid would happen? Ask the part, what are you afraid will happen if I start to live in gratitude? What if I overcome this resistance? So, in other words, by getting to know this part of you that probably has really good intentions, it's there trying to protect you. So if we bypass our protectors, quite often we'll usually have some sort of backlash. And maybe that's a little bit of what you're experiencing, like this acting out, like there's a backlash when we bypass these protectors. So I would say spend a little bit of time, do the attunement meditation. I already know you have access to it, to get in touch with that part and see if you can find out its thoughts and feelings and what this part is trying to protect you from. And then you know what to do with the rest of the meditation. If that part will give you permission to connect with that vulnerable, perhaps exiled part of you that it's protecting, you know the rest of the procedure to do that by listening to the attunement meditations that we've done. All right, so very glad that, Valerie, you will be tuning in. And yes, I do believe this will help you reduce the pain in your body. And Pascal asks, is the healing process from our ancestors the same as healing from the loss of someone close to you, like a younger sibling? It could be. It could very well be. Losing anyone. You might have taken on the sadness of your parents or grandparents, plus your own sadness. It could be that you're still so connected to the soul of that sibling. So I want to say one important thing about healing these legacy burdens. We're not divorcing ourselves in such a way that we disown a family member, or we say, look, your stress is killing me, so I'm cutting you out. We can still maintain a healthy reverence and honoring of our ancestors, but just sort of cleaning that connection and getting rid of the trauma and the pain, where they actually benefit and they get a healing as well. So what we heal for ourselves, we are healing for generations in the past and generations to come. So thank you, my dear friends, for tuning in today for this teaching, this explanation of intergenerational trauma. I do hope that I will see you at the Real Self-Love Live, where I can take your questions. And of course, I'd love to see you in the Hero Collective. So check out my website, andreapennington.com, where you can sign up to get advance notice of when enrollment begins. It is going to be a blessed experience of live coaching from me, some video modules, quarterly masterclasses by some of my favorite luminaries that really have gifts and healing techniques that can help us all. So thank you so much for being here. It's very good to see some familiar names and faces. I am sending you so much love from the south of France. And until next time, remember, my friend, you are a gift to the world. So share your presence with passion. Much love, everyone. Take good care. See you next week.